They found the first body at dawn, frozen solid in a snowdrift 20 yards from the burning sawmill. Danny Tucker, 19 years old, shot through the back while crawling away from an inferno that had been deliberately set to kill him and 15 other ranch hands. By the time investigators finished counting corpses scattered across the Montana wilderness, they discovered the worst mass murder in state history, all because an old man convinced his family that a bent nail was worth 16 lives. This is the story of how economic desperation transformed ordinary people into systematic killers, and how a single piece of damaged hardware became justification for a massacre that would haunt an entire county for generations. This is the true story of the Montana Sawmill Massacre of 1980. This video contains depictions of extreme violence and explores themes of economic desperation, family obsession, and how perceived slights can escalate into unthinkable brutality. If you appreciate deep investigations into American tragedies that challenge our understanding of human nature, please subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. Now, let's go back to where it all started. What began with 16 hard-working ranch hands seeking shelter from a blizzard would end with their bodies scattered through a burning mill, all because one man believed that bending a piece of metal was equivalent to destroying his family's soul. The most terrifying thing about this massacre isn't the violence itself, but how easily normal grief became homicidal madness. The abandoned Beckett Sawmill squatted in the Montana wilderness like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, its broken ribs of timber reaching toward a sky that promised nothing but more snow, more cold, more death. Locals had taken to calling it the Boneyard, not just because of how the wind moaned through the shattered boards like voices of the dead, but because everything about the place spoke of endings. December 1980. The temperature hadn't climbed above zero in 6 weeks. The lumber industry that had sustained Dawson County for 40 years was collapsing faster than anyone could have imagined. Families were burning heirloom furniture to stay warm. The Hendersons were burning books because books burned longer than newspapers. Desperation had a smell in Dawson County that winter. Wood smoke mixed with something bitter and desperate, the scent of people consuming their own past just to survive another day. The Beckett Sawmill had once been the pride of the county, employing 200 men and processing 1,000 board feet of lumber per day. Now it was a ruin, most of its roof caved in from accumulated snow. But the mill wasn't entirely abandoned. In the northwest corner, where surviving roof and improvisation had created shelter, the Beckett family had made their home. Oren Beckett was 61 years old and had spent every one of those years believing that the Beckett name meant something in Montana. His grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1896. His father had built the sawmill in 1936 during the Depression. Oren had inherited both the mill and the faith, had expanded the operation through the 50s and 60s, had employed half the county. The mill had started failing in 1976 when Canadian lumber companies began undercutting American prices. Environmental regulations made harvesting more expensive. The final blow came in 1979 when the bank called in their loans and initiated foreclosure proceedings. Oren had fought it, hired lawyers he couldn't afford, spent his family's last savings on legal fees that only delayed the inevitable. So the Becketts stayed, squatters in their own empire, living in the ruins of their father's dream, surviving on food stamps while watching their neighbors abandon the county one family at a time. Oren's hair had gone white. His hand shook when he tried to light a cigarette. His eyes had developed an intensity that made people uncomfortable. Flint Beckett was 34 and had never lived anywhere but Dawson County. He was the responsible one, handling what little money came in, driving to town for supplies. 6 feet 2 inches tall, built like the athlete he'd been in high school, but carrying the weight of watching his family slowly disintegrate. He'd been married once, but his wife had left when the mill closed, taking their daughter to Seattle. Duke Beckett was 31 and angry about everything: the weather, the economy, the government, the banks. He was shorter than Flint, but broader through the shoulders, with hands scarred from machinery work and a temper that had gotten worse as their situation deteriorated. Duke believed their circumstances were the result of conspiracy, that powerful interests had deliberately targeted the Beckett family. Rowena Beckett was 28 and the most dangerous member of her family, though none of them recognized it yet. She'd inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's intensity, a combination that made her seem fragile right up until she wasn't. She'd been the smartest of the children, but had stayed home to care for her dying mother and never left. Now she served as the family's emotional center through force of will and absolute loyalty to her father's vision. The most important thing in Oren's office was a single iron nail mounted on the wall above his bed. Hand-forged, square-headed, 4 inches long, it had been made by Oren's father in 1936 and hammered into the mill's cornerstone during construction. The nail had become Oren's talisman, his proof that the Beckett family had once mattered. During the foreclosure proceedings, Oren had extracted that nail from the cornerstone. It was the only piece of the family legacy he'd managed to preserve. The nail had to stay perfect, had to remain straight and true, because if something that small and permanent could be damaged, then nothing was safe. And on December 15, 1980, when 16 ranch hands would seek shelter from a blizzard, one of them would accidentally bend that nail while trying to repair a broken board. That bent nail would become justification for the worst massacre in Montana history. The blizzard hit Dawson County on December 15th like the wrath of an angry god, dropping temperatures to -37 degrees and driving snow horizontally with winds that howled at 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The storm had been building for 2 days, but forecasters predicted it would pass to the north. They were wrong. By 3 o'clock, the 16 ranch hands working the Morrison cattle spread knew they were in serious trouble. They'd been moving Black Angus to winter pasture when the storm intensified beyond anything they'd prepared for. The cattle scattered across 2,000 acres of rough terrain, spooked by wind and stinging snow. These weren't green hands or city boys. They were experienced cattlemen, most of them 3rd or 4th generation ranchers who'd survived Montana winters their entire lives. Men like Tom Bradley, 52, who'd worked cattle for 35 years. Like Jake Morrison, 28, whose grandfather had homesteaded the ranch in 1908. Like Carlos Mendez, 43, who'd come north from Texas 15 years earlier. They were practical men who understood that pride was a luxury you couldn't afford when nature was trying to kill you. When Jake Morrison made the decision to seek shelter, nobody argued. The abandoned Beckett mill was 2 miles northeast. While none of them liked trespassing, they understood the mathematics of survival. Shelter meant life. Everything else was negotiable. They reached the mill at 4:30, 16 men on horseback leading pack animals and what cattle they'd managed to gather. The horses were exhausted, ice forming on their muzzles. The men weren't much better, snow caked on their clothes and ice forming on their beards, despite wool scarves wrapped around their faces. Jake Morrison found Oren Beckett in his makeshift office, sitting at a desk made from sawhorses and plywood, staring at papers from better times. Oren looked up when Jake knocked, and Jake was struck by how fragile the man seemed. "Mr. Beckett," Jake said, removing his hat despite the cold, "I'm Jake Morrison. We've got 16 men and livestock sheltering in your building. The storm caught us moving cattle. We'll be gone soon as it passes." Oren nodded slowly. "Morrison, your grandfather was Ezra Morrison." "Yes, sir. You knew him?" "He testified against my father during the water rights dispute in 1941. Helped the county take our creek access." Jake felt something cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "Mr. Beckett, that was before I was born. We're just looking for shelter." "I know what you're looking for," Oren said quietly. The ranch hands made themselves comfortable in the building's main space. They built a small fire using lumber scraps, shared coffee from thermoses, and food from their packs. They talked quietly about the storm, about when it might pass, about the cattle they'd lost. It was Carlos Mendez who noticed the loose board flapping in the wind near the north wall. The board banged against the wall frame every time the wind gusted, a sound like someone knocking to get in. The noise was driving the horses crazy, and Carlos knew agitated animals in close quarters could become dangerous. He found a hammer in the mill's scattered tools and approached the loose board. The nail holding it was bent and loose, probably damaged by years of weather. Carlos tried to straighten it, but the metal was old and brittle. When he attempted to drive it properly into the wood, it bent even further, nearly 45 degrees off true. Carlos didn't think anything of it. He found another nail in his pocket, drove it through the board into solid wood, and considered the problem solved. The banging stopped. The horses calmed down. He had no way of knowing that the nail he'd accidentally bent had been hand-forged by Oren Beckett's father in 1936, that Oren had personally placed it during construction, that it represented everything the Beckett family stood for. Oren discovered the bent nail at 6 o'clock during his evening inspection of the building. When he saw the nail, bent nearly double, his vision actually darkened around the edges. This wasn't accident. The nail had been straight for 44 years, had survived ice storms and hail and winds that had torn pieces off the building. And now, on the very day strangers sheltered in his mill, it was bent beyond repair. Oren walked back to his family's living space and found his 3 children gathered around their scrap metal stove, playing cards and sharing a can of beans. They looked up when he entered, saw his face, and knew something had changed. "They bent it," Oren said quietly. "Bent what, Dad?" Flint asked. Oren held up the nail. "The cornerstone nail, the one Pop hammered in during the dedication ceremony. These Morrison people didn't just take shelter, they desecrated what's holy." Rowena looked at the bent nail and felt rage bloom in her chest. "They're trying to finish what the bank started," she said quietly. "Erase us, completely." "What do you mean?" Flint asked. "Think about it," Rowena continued. "The Morrison Ranch borders our property. They've been watching us, waiting for us to leave so they can claim this land. But we won't leave, so they're sending a message. That nothing we built matters," Oren said, standing up. "That our family name means nothing. That they can come into our home and destroy what's sacred, and there won't be consequences." His voice was getting stronger. "Your great-grandfather homesteaded this land in 1896. Your grandfather built this mill with his own hands during the Depression. I ran it for 30 years, employed half the county. And now they're telling us it was all worthless. That we're worthless. That they can come into our home and bend our bloodline the same way they bent this nail." "Bent our bloodline?" Flint repeated. "That's what this is. This nail represents 4 generations of Beckett blood and sacrifice. When they bent it, they bent us. They broke something that was never meant to be broken." Duke was pacing now, his hands clenched into fists. "So what do? "We defend what's ours," Rowena said simply. "We show them that the Beckett family doesn't take disrespect lying down." "They're just ranch hands seeking shelter," Flint said carefully. "Of course they know," Rowena snapped. "You think Carlos Mendez accidentally found the one nail in this building that mattered? They chose tonight, when the storm would cover their tracks, to send their message." "She's right," Oren said. "This isn't random. This is coordinated. They've been patient, but we're still here, still fighting, so now they're escalating." "What do you want us to do?" Duke asked. Oren held up the bent nail again. "I want us to send a message back. I want them to understand that when you attack a Beckett family legacy, there are consequences." Rowena stood up and walked to her father's side. "They came into our home and desecrated what was sacred to us. Now they need to understand what that costs." She looked at her brothers. "We've lost everything else. Our mill, our land, our reputation, our future. But we still have our honor. And if we let them take that too, then we really are finished." The transformation was complete. Grief had become rage, desperation had become purpose, and a bent nail had become justification for the worst massacre in Montana history. The planning began at 7 o'clock that evening, while the storm raged outside and the 16 ranch hands settled in for what they assumed would be an uncomfortable but survivable night. The Beckett family gathered around their scrap metal stove, speaking in whispers swallowed by the wind, howling through the mill's broken framework. Oren had transformed from broken old man to military strategist, drawing on memories from Korea where he'd learned that successful operations required preparation, coordination, and absolute commitment. He spread a hand-drawn map of the mill across the makeshift table, marking exit points with a pencil sharpened so many times it was barely 2 inches long. 3 main exits, he said, pointing to the map, loading dock doors on the east, personnel entrance on the south, equipment bay on the west. We blocked those. They're trapped. Duke studied the map intensely. What about windows? Too high, too small. Most are broken anyway, covered with boards. Anyone trying to get out that way would have to break through wood and glass while we're watching. Flint looked uncomfortable. Dad, we're talking about trapping people inside a building. That's kidnapping, probably worse. What comes next, Rowena said quietly, is justice. These people desecrated our family legacy. Now, they need to understand consequences. They bent a nail, Rowena. They attacked our legacy, Oren said with absolute conviction. Everything our family built, everything we represent, everything we've suffered to preserve. That nail was the last piece of my father's work, the only thing proving we mattered. The first step was blocking exits. Oren sent Duke and Flint into the storm with a chainsaw to fell trees across the 3 main doorways. Not completely blocking them, which would be too obvious, but creating barriers that would slow anyone trying to escape. They worked in darkness, using the storm as cover. The chainsaw's roar was swallowed by wind howling at 70 miles per hour. Duke cut down 3 pine trees while Flint dragged them into position. From inside, it would look like storm damage. While her brothers worked outside, Rowena handled interior security. She moved through the mill like a ghost, carrying iron latches salvaged from original equipment, heavy-duty hardware designed to secure industrial machinery, each capable of holding several hundred pounds of pressure. She installed latches on the inside of each exit door, positioning them where they could be quickly engaged but wouldn't be noticed unless someone was specifically looking. The latches would turn the mill from shelter into prison with 3 simple movements. The final preparation was the most dangerous. The mill contained tons of sawdust accumulated over decades, essentially wood powder that was explosive when ignited. Rowena and Duke spent 2 hours moving through the building with 5-gallon containers of kerosene, soaking sawdust piles strategically throughout the structure, creating a network of accelerant that would turn the building into an inferno within minutes. They avoided the area where ranch hands were sheltering, not from mercy, but because they wanted to control timing and direction. By midnight, everything was ready. Exits blocked, latches installed, accelerant in place. All that remained was the final conversation, the moment when the Beckett family committed to transforming from victims into something far worse. Once we do this, Flint said quietly, there's no taking it back. We'll be murderers. We'll be Becketts, Oren replied. We'll be people who stood up for our family when everyone else wanted us to disappear quietly. The law won't see it that way. The law didn't protect us when the bank stole our mill. The law didn't help when the county changed zoning to force us out. The law has done nothing but stand aside while our family name was dragged through mud. Rowena leaned forward. Flint, these people bent the one thing we had left that proved our family mattered. If we let that stand, if we let them walk away laughing about humiliating the Becketts, then we really are finished. And if we kill them, then people will remember that crossing a Beckett has consequences. Maybe the next group of vultures will think twice. Duke spoke for the first time in an hour. I'm tired of being powerless. Tired of watching everything Dad built get torn down while we're supposed to smile and accept it. These people gave us a chance to fight back. Oren looked at each child in turn. This is a family decision, together or not at all. But understand what we're choosing. We're choosing to matter again. We're choosing to prove the Beckett name still means something. At 1:30, Flint made his choice, not because he believed his father's justifications, but because he couldn't bear abandoning his family. All right, but we do this quick. We don't make them suffer. Agreed, Oren said. This is about justice, not cruelty. Rowena distributed tasks. Duke would secure latches, trapping the ranch hands inside. She would ignite sawdust piles using kerosene-soaked torches. Flint would monitor exits, preventing escapes. Oren would oversee from his office. At exactly 2 o'clock, Rowena Beckett dropped the first torch into kerosene-soaked sawdust near the mill's main support beam. Flames spread faster than anticipated, racing along sawdust trails like lit fuses, engulfing support posts and conveyor equipment within seconds. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The abandoned sawmill became a burning labyrinth filled with choking smoke and the roar of flames consuming decades of accumulated combustible material. Temperatures shot up 20 degrees in the first minute, 30 in the second, as fire fed on everything flammable. The ranch hands woke to confusion and growing horror. Tom Bradley was first to understand, shaking men awake and shouting orders barely audible over advancing flames. Jake Morrison tried to reach the main exit and found it blocked by fallen trees and secured with iron latches that wouldn't budge. Carlos Mendez found himself trapped in a nightmare he couldn't understand. They'd sought shelter and awakened in hell, surrounded by flames that seemed to erupt from the building's bones. He grabbed a fire axe and began attacking the nearest door, but fallen trees and iron latches made escape impossible. Outside, the Beckett family took positions. Duke at the main exit, rifle ready. Rowena at the loading dock, armed with a shotgun and absolute conviction. Flint at the personnel entrance, struggling with doubts rapidly overwhelmed by reality. Oren stood in his office watching through a broken window as decades of family work burned like a funeral pyre. The bent nail was still in his hand, no longer symbol of desecration, but justification for transformation from victims into something far more dangerous. Inside the burning mill, 16 men who'd committed no crime beyond seeking shelter began fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't understand. The Ehim trap had been sprung, the fire was spreading, and there was nowhere left to run. The fire spread through the mill like a living thing, hungry and intelligent, racing along sawdust trails with a speed that shocked even Oren Beckett. What he'd envisioned as a controlled burn became a roaring monster that consumed everything in its path with terrifying efficiency. The mill's design, originally intended to facilitate lumber processing, now served as a perfect chimney system. Air flowed through broken walls and missing roof sections, creating a wind tunnel effect that fed oxygen to flames and accelerated their spread. Temperature inside climbed from 20 degrees below zero to 60 degrees above in less than 5 minutes, a 100-degree swing that created its own weather system within the mill's walls. Oren watched from his office window as flames that had started near the main support beam spread to conveyor systems, then to sorting areas, then to storage sections where decades of sawdust had accumulated. The fire moved faster than a man could run, faster than he'd calculated, faster than he could control. Tom Bradley had spent 35 years working cattle in conditions that tested human endurance, but he'd never faced anything like the hell that erupted around him at 2:15. The first thing he understood was that this wasn't accidental. Fires didn't start simultaneously in 6 different locations. Someone had planned this. Someone had trapped them deliberately. "Jake!" he shouted over advancing flames. "Get everyone to the north wall, away from the main fire!" Jake Morrison was already moving, shaking men awake and pushing them toward the only section where flames hadn't penetrated. But even as they retreated, he could see fire spreading along walls above them, consuming the building's framework like a slow-motion explosion. Carlos Mendez grabbed a fire axe and began attacking the nearest exit door with desperate efficiency. He'd grown up in Texas, had fought grass fires that could consume 1,000 acres in an hour, and understood their survival window was measured in minutes. The axe bit into weather-weakened wood, but iron latches held firm, designed to secure equipment weighing thousands of pounds. "The door is locked from outside," Carlos shouted. "Someone trapped us in here." That realization transformed fear into rage. These weren't victims of accident or disaster. They were targets. Someone had deliberately created this inferno and sealed them inside to die. If this was murder, then they were going to fight back like men facing murder. Billy Roberts, 26, and a former rodeo rider who'd survived being trampled by bulls, found water tanks from the mill's old fire suppression system. Most were empty or frozen, but 3 contained enough liquid to be useful. Not enough to fight the fire directly, but enough to soak clothing and create breathing space in the choking smoke. "Over here," Billy shouted. "Water, soak your shirts." The men formed a bucket brigade using hats and anything that could hold water, soaking clothes and covering faces with wet fabric that filtered smoke. It bought them precious minutes to think and plan and fight instead of simply dying. Meanwhile, the fire continued its relentless advance. What Oren hadn't anticipated was how the mill's metal framework would conduct and concentrate heat. Steel beams that had supported conveyor systems now became furnace elements, glowing red-hot and radiating temperatures that could kill through proximity alone. Outside, Duke Beckett stood at his position near the main exit, rifle ready, but began to understand that his family had miscalculated badly. Flames were visible through every crack in the building's walls. The roar was so loud he could barely think. Heat was radiating through metal doors, making them too hot to touch. "Dad," he shouted toward Oren's office, "the fire's too big. It's going to bring down the whole building." Oren couldn't hear him over the sound of his life's work being consumed. He stood at his window, watching 40 years of family history disappear into flame and smoke, and felt something like awe at the destructive power they'd unleashed. Inside the mill, the ranch hands had found original construction ladders, wooden structures used during building and never removed. Pete Williams, a former Army engineer who'd learned improvised solutions during Vietnam, began organizing an escape attempt that didn't rely on blocked exits. "The loading dock has a 30-foot opening," Pete shouted, barely audible over the fire's roar. "If we can get ladders up there, we can get out through the roof section." They began moving with military precision despite chaos. Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison held ladders steady while Carlos Mendez and Billy Roberts climbed toward openings still relatively clear of fire. But even as they worked, they could feel the building's structure beginning to fail. The mill's main support beam, a steel girder that had anchored the building for 44 years, began to sag under thermal stress exceeding 800 degrees. Metal expanded, joints weakened, and connections that had held firm through decades of Montana winters began failing under conditions they'd never been designed to withstand. Rowena Beckett, positioned at the loading dock with her shotgun, watched through flames as men appeared at high openings, silhouetted against fire like demons emerging from hell. She raised her weapon, then hesitated. Shooting men who were burning alive seemed like cruelty beyond what even this situation justified. But her hesitation lasted only seconds. These men had desecrated her family's legacy. They'd bent the sacred nail. They'd forced her family to this extreme response. Whatever happened now was their fault for showing such disrespect to people who'd already lost everything except honor. She fired twice, watching 2 figures disappear back into smoke. The sound of gunshots penetrated even the fire's roar, reaching men inside like a death sentence. Not only were they trapped in a burning building, but someone was shooting at anyone who tried to escape. This wasn't just murder. This was systematic execution. Carlos Mendez, who'd spent 15 years learning to survive in country that could kill careless men, made a decision that would define the next hour. If someone was trying to murder him and his friends, then he was going to make them pay for every inch. "If they want to kill us," he shouted to anyone who could hear, "they're going to have to work for it." The mill's internal temperature had reached over 900 degrees near the main fire, hot enough to ignite clothing, at 20 feet distance. Smoke had reduced visibility to less than 5 feet. The building's framework groaned and screamed as metal expanded beyond tolerance limits. Flint Beckett, positioned at the personnel entrance, felt the ground shake as part of the mill's roof structure gave way. A section of burning timber crashed into the area where ranch hands had been sleeping, sending up a shower of sparks that ignited new fires throughout the building. The sound was like a freight train derailing in slow motion. "Dad!" Flint screamed toward his father's office, but his voice was lost in the mechanical symphony of a building dying violently. Steel twisted, wood exploded, and somewhere in smoke and chaos, men were fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't see and a fire that showed no mercy. Oren Beckett stood at his window, still holding the bent nail, and watched his family's final legacy transform into something that would be remembered not as justice or honor, but as the night the Becketts became the monsters their neighbors had always suspected they might be. The mill burned like a furnace, like a crematorium, like the funeral pyre of everything the Beckett name had once represented. And inside that inferno, 16 men who'd sought nothing but shelter from a storm continued their desperate fight for survival against enemies, both human and elemental. The fire spread through the mill like a living thing, hungry and intelligent, racing along sawdust trails with a speed that shocked even Oren Beckett. What he'd envisioned as a controlled burn became a roaring monster that consumed everything in its path with terrifying efficiency. The mill's design, originally intended to facilitate lumber processing, now served as a perfect chimney system. Air flowed through broken walls and missing roof sections, creating a wind tunnel effect that fed oxygen to flames and accelerated their spread. Temperature inside climbed from 20 degrees below zero to 60 degrees above in less than 5 minutes. A 100-degree swing that created its own weather system within the mill's walls. Oren watched from his office window as flames that had started near the main support beam spread to conveyor systems, then to sorting areas, then to storage, sections where decades of sawdust had accumulated. The fire moved faster than a man could run, faster than he'd calculated, faster than he could control. Tom Bradley had spent 35 years working cattle in conditions that tested human endurance, but he'd never faced anything like the hell that erupted around him at 2:15. The first thing he understood was that this wasn't accidental. Fires didn't start simultaneously in 6 different locations. Someone had planned this. Someone had trapped them deliberately. "Jake," he shouted over advancing flames, "get everyone to the north wall, away from the main fire." Jake Morrison was already moving, shaking men awake and pushing them toward the only section where flames hadn't penetrated. But even as they retreated, he could see fire spreading along walls above them, consuming the building's framework like a slow-motion explosion. Carlos Mendez grabbed a fire axe and began attacking the nearest exit door with desperate efficiency. He'd grown up in Texas, had fought grass fires that could consume 1,000 acres in an hour, and understood their survival window was measured in minutes. The axe bit into weather-weakened wood, but iron latches held firm, designed to secure equipment weighing thousands of pounds. "The door's locked from outside," Carlos shouted. "Someone trapped us in here." That realization transformed fear into rage. These weren't victims of accident or disaster. They were targets. Someone had deliberately created this inferno and sealed them inside to die. If this was murder, then they were going to fight back like men facing murder. Billy Roberts, 26, and a former rodeo rider who'd survived being trampled by bulls, found water tanks from the mill's old fire suppression system. Most were empty or frozen, but 3 contained enough liquid to be useful. Not enough to fight the fire directly, but enough to soak clothing and create breathing space in the choking smoke. "Over here!" Billy shouted. "Water! Soak your shirts!" The men formed a bucket brigade using hats and anything that could hold water, soaking clothes and covering faces with wet fabric that filtered smoke. It bought them precious minutes to think and plan and fight instead of simply dying. Meanwhile, the fire continued its relentless advance. What Oren hadn't anticipated was how the mill's metal framework would conduct and concentrate heat. Steel beams that had supported conveyor systems now became furnace elements, glowing red-hot and radiating temperatures that could kill through proximity alone. Outside, Duke Beckett stood at his position near the main exit, rifle ready, but began to understand that his family had miscalculated badly. Flames were visible through every crack in the building's walls. The roar was so loud he could barely think. Heat was radiating through metal doors, making them too hot to touch. "Dad!" he shouted toward Oren's office. "The fire's too big. It's going to bring down the whole building." Oren couldn't hear him over the sound of his life's work being consumed. He stood at his window, watching 40 years of family history disappear into flame and smoke, and felt something like awe at the destructive power they'd unleashed. Inside the mill, the ranch hands had found original construction ladders, wooden structures used during building and never removed. Pete Williams, a former Army engineer who'd learned improvised solutions during Vietnam, began organizing an escape attempt that didn't rely on blocked exits. "The loading dock has a 30-foot opening," Pete shouted, barely audible over the fire's roar. "If we can get ladders up there, we can get out through the roof section." They began moving with military precision despite chaos. Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison held ladders steady, while Carlos Mendez and Billy Roberts climbed toward openings still relatively clear of fire. But even as they worked, they could feel the building's structure beginning to fail. The mill's main support beam, a steel girder that had anchored the building for 44 years, began to sag under thermal stress exceeding 800 degrees. Metal expanded, joints weakened, and connections that had held firm through decades of Montana winters began failing under conditions they'd never been designed to withstand. Rowena Beckett, positioned at the loading dock with her shotgun, watched through flames as men appeared at high openings, silhouetted against fire, like demons emerging from hell. She raised her weapon, then hesitated. Shooting men who were burning alive seemed like cruelty beyond what even this situation justified. But her hesitation lasted only seconds. These men had desecrated her family's legacy. They'd bent the sacred nail. They'd forced her family to this extreme response. Whatever happened now was their fault for showing such disrespect to people who'd already lost everything except honor. She fired twice, watching two figures disappear back into smoke. The sound of gunshots penetrated even the fire's roar, reaching men inside like a death sentence. Not only were they trapped in a burning building, but someone was shooting at anyone who tried to escape. This wasn't just murder. This was systematic execution. Carlos Mendez, who'd spent 15 years learning to survive in country that could kill careless men, made a decision that would define the next hour. If someone was trying to murder him and his friends, then he was going to make them pay for every inch. "If they want to kill us," he shouted to anyone who could hear, "they're going to have to work for it." The mill's internal temperature had reached over 900 degrees near the main fire, hot enough to ignite clothing at 20 feet distance. Smoke had reduced visibility to less than 5 feet. The building's framework groaned and screamed as metal expanded beyond tolerance limits. Flint Beckett, positioned at the personnel entrance, felt the ground shake as part of us. The mill's roof structure gave way. A section of burning timber crashed into the area where ranch hands had been sleeping, sending up a shower of sparks that ignited new fires throughout the building. The sound was like a freight train derailing in slow motion. "Dad!" Flint screamed toward his father's office, but his voice was lost in the mechanical symphony of a building dying violently. Steel twisted, wood exploded, and somewhere in smoke and chaos, Men were fighting for their lives against an enemy they couldn't see and a fire that showed no mercy. Oren Beckett stood at his window, still holding the bent nail, and watched his family's final legacy transform into something that would be remembered not as justice or honor, but as the night the Becketts became the monsters their neighbors had always suspected they might be. The mill burned like a furnace, like a crematorium, like the funeral pyre of everything the Beckett name had once represented. And inside that inferno, 16 men who'd sought nothing but shelter from a storm continued their desperate fight for survival against enemies both human and elemental. At 2:47 in the morning, the first ranch hand broke through the mill's burning framework and crawled into the snow outside. Danny Tucker, 19 years old and the youngest member of the crew, had found a section of wall where fire had consumed enough wooden framework to create a gap barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. His clothes were smoking, his hands burned from grabbing red-hot metal, but he was alive and outside and breathing air that didn't sear his lungs. He made it 23 feet before Duke Beckett's rifle shot dropped him face first into a snowdrift that turned red around his body. Duke stood over the boy's corpse, working the bolt action to chamber another round, and felt something like religious ecstasy. This wasn't murder. This was justice being served to people who'd attacked his family's honor. Danny Tucker had crawled out of that mill because he was guilty, because he knew what he'd done, because he was trying to escape consequences. "One down," Duke shouted toward his sister's position, 15 to go. Inside the mill, the rifle shot reached surviving ranch hands like a death sentence. Not only were they trapped in a burning building, but someone was systematically executing anyone who managed to escape. Tom Bradley, who'd led men through cattle drives and blizzards and situations that tested human endurance, felt something break inside his chest. "They're killing us," he said to Jake Morrison, barely audible over roaring flames. "These people are trying to murder every one of us." "Why?" Jake asked, though he was already moving toward a section where fire had weakened wooden supports. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is making them pay." At 3:15, Carlos Mendez and Billy Roberts managed to break through the loading dock wall using axes and pure desperation. They crawled through. A gap in burning timber rolled in snow to extinguish their burning clothes, and found themselves face to face with Rowena Beckett, who stood 15 feet away with a 12-gauge shotgun aimed at their chests. "Please," Carlos said, raising his hands, "we didn't do anything. We just needed shelter." "You bent the nail," Rowena said calmly. "You came into our home and desecrated what was sacred to our family." "What nail?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "The cornerstone nail, my grandfather's nail. You bent it on purpose to send us a message." Carlos suddenly understood. The loose board, the bent nail he'd accidentally damaged while trying to fix the banging. "That was an accident. I was trying to stop the noise. I didn't know it meant anything." "Liar," Rowena said, and pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast caught Carlos' center mass, throwing him backward into snow. Billy Roberts tried to run, made it maybe 10 steps before the second barrel dropped him beside a pile of sawdust, slowly turning pink with blood. Rowena reloaded methodically, the way her father had taught her during childhood hunting seasons. 2 down, she thought. 14 left. But 3 more men had escaped during the distraction. Pete Williams, the former Army engineer, had led Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison through a section of collapsed wall on the mill's north side, away from the main fighting. They crawled through knee-deep snow, trying to reach the tree line where they might find cover from both gunfire and the storm. Rowena saw them moving and began tracking them through snow, using a kerosene lantern to follow their trail. The storm provided perfect cover for hunting. Wind masked the sound of her approach. Falling snow would soon cover blood, and cold would kill anyone not dressed for extended exposure to minus 30-degree temperatures. She followed their tracks like a predator, following wounded prey, patient and methodical, and absolutely certain she was doing what needed to be done. These men had attacked her family's honor. Now, they were going to pay the price such attacks demanded. At 3:45, she found Pete Williams collapsed beside Martin's Fork Creek, hypothermic and barely conscious. He looked up when her lantern light fell across his face, saw her standing over him with a shotgun, and tried to speak. "Please," he whispered, "I have children, 2 little girls." "You should have thought about them before you came here to destroy our family," Rowena said, and ended his suffering with a single shot. Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison were 50 yards upstream, trying to cross the creek on ice too thin to support their weight. Bradley had fallen through and was struggling to climb out of water that would kill him in minutes. Morrison was trying to help, both men focused on survival and unaware that death was approaching through the storm. Rowena shot Morrison first, then Bradley while he was still chest-deep in freezing water. Both bodies fell into the creek and were swept downstream by current, disappearing into darkness beyond her lantern's reach. 5 dead, she counted, 11 left. Duke had taken his father's paranoid worldview and transformed it into religious doctrine. Standing over Danny Tucker's body, he began to understand that this wasn't just about a bent nail or family honor. This was about proving the Beckett name still meant something, that their family wouldn't be erased quietly. "Dad was right," he said to Flint, who'd moved closer to hear over the storm. "These people have been planning this. The bent nail was just their way of telling us they were ready to finish what the bank started." Flint looked at his brother, saw something in Duke's eyes that made him step backward. "Duke, these are ranch hands, working men trying to survive a storm." "Then why did they bend the nail? Why that specific nail, the one that mattered most? You think that's coincidence?" "I think it was an accident. You're not thinking clearly. The stress is getting to you, but that's okay. I can handle this. We're defending our family." Inside the mill, surviving ranch hands had found weapons and were preparing to fight their way out. Fire axes, sledgehammers, pieces of metal pipe that could cave in a skull. If the Becketts wanted to kill them all, they were going to discover that cornered men with nothing left to lose could be extraordinarily dangerous. Frank Martinez, 42 and a veteran of bar fights and range disputes, led 6 men toward the main exit where Duke was positioned. They moved through smoke so thick they could barely see their hands, following sound and heat signature. "When we hit that door," Frank whispered, "we go through him like he's not there. No mercy, no hesitation. These people are trying to murder us, so we kill them first." At 4:03, they burst through the main exit in a coordinated assault that caught Duke completely off guard. Frank Martinez hit him with a sledgehammer that shattered his left shoulder and sent him sprawling into snow. The rifle flew from his hands, disappearing into a snowdrift. But Duke wasn't finished. Pain meant nothing compared to knowledge that his family's honor was being defended. He pulled a .44 Magnum from his coat and began firing at men already scattering into the storm, hitting 2 before the others disappeared into darkness. The blizzard was both enemy and ally now. It provided cover for escaping ranch hands, but also guaranteed that anyone without proper shelter would die of exposure within hours. Temperature had dropped to -35 degrees. Wind speeds approached 80 miles per hour. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Flint Beckett stood in the snow, watching his brother reload a pistol while their family's mill burned like a funeral pyre behind them, and finally understood they'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They weren't defending honor anymore. They were committing mass murder. "Duke," he said quietly, "we need to stop this." His brother looked at him with eyes belonging to someone Flint no longer recognized. "We stop when they're all dead, when everyone understands that crossing a Beckett has consequences." The mill collapsed inward with a sound like thunder, sending up a shower of sparks that illuminated snow for hundreds of yards. In that moment of terrible clarity, Flint could see bodies scattered around the building's perimeter, could see blood staining snow, could see his sister moving through the storm with lantern and shotgun, hunting human beings like animals. They'd wanted to send a message about family honor. Instead, they'd become the monsters that would haunt Dawson County's nightmares for generations. At 4:21 in the morning, While his sister hunted the last escaping ranch hands through the storm and his brother reloaded his pistol to finish wounded men, Flint Beckett made a discovery that shattered his understanding of everything they'd done. Walking past the mill's collapsed north wall, where flames had exposed the building's original foundation, he saw the cornerstone his grandfather had laid in 1936, and there, embedded in the stone, was the original nail. The sacred nail. The nail his father claimed had been bent by Carlos Mendez as deliberate desecration. Flint stared at it for a full minute, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The nail was straight, perfectly straight, untouched, exactly as it had always been. Which meant the nail his father had shown them, the bent nail that had justified this massacre, was just another nail. Some random piece of hardware damaged by weather or age or simple wear. Nothing sacred, nothing symbolic, nothing that mattered to anyone except a desperate old man looking for reasons to believe his life had meaning. The revelation hit Flint like physical force, doubling him over in the snow. 16 men were dead or dying. His family had become mass murderers, all based on his father's delusion, his need to transform accident into attack, bent metal into desecration, worthy of death. Flint ran toward his father's office, slipping through snow now ankle-deep with ash and debris. The building was mostly collapsed, but Oren's office remained partially intact, protected by steel girders that hadn't yet succumbed to heat. He found his father sitting at his makeshift desk, staring at the bent nail in his palm, completely oblivious to chaos around him. The office was filled with smoke that made breathing agony, but Oren seemed not to notice. Blood ran from his mouth where heat and smoke had damaged his lungs, but his expression was peaceful, almost beatific. "Dad!" Flint shouted, grabbing his father's shoulders. "The nail you're holding, it's not the cornerstone nail. The real nail is still in the foundation, untouched. This whole thing, all these deaths, it's based on nothing." Oren looked at his son with eyes belonging to someone who'd retreated so far from reality that returning was no longer possible. "The nail is bent," he said calmly. "They bent our bloodline." "No, Dad, look at me. The nail in the cornerstone is fine. This one you're holding is just random hardware that got damaged by weather. Carlos Mendez didn't attack our family. He fixed a loose board." "They sent a message," Oren continued, as if Flint hadn't spoken. "They told us the Beckett name means nothing, but we showed them. We defended our legacy." Blood bubbled from Oren's mouth when he spoke. Smoke and heat had damaged something fundamental in his respiratory system, but he seemed unaware of his body's distress, completely focused on the bent nail and what it represented in his fractured mind. "Dad, we killed innocent men. 16 ranch hands who just needed shelter from a storm. We murdered them over nothing." "Over everything," Oren corrected quietly. "Over honor, over family, over the idea that a man's work should matter after he's gone." Flint heard gunshots outside, heard his brother's voice shouting orders, heard his sister calling out positions as she tracked last survivors through the storm. His family was completing their massacre while he tried to explain reality to a man who'd chosen madness over acknowledging that his life's work had failed for reasons having nothing to do with bent nails or family honor or conspiracies. "We have to stop this," Flint said. "Right now, before they kill anyone else. We have to tell Duke and Rowena that we made a mistake." For the first time, Oren looked directly at his son. There was no mistake. These people came into our home and showed us disrespect. Now they're paying the price. The way things used to be handled before lawyers and bureaucrats convinced everyone that honor was old-fashioned. "Honor!" Flint's voice broke. "We're murdering innocent men in cold blood. This isn't honor, this is madness." Oren smiled, blood staining his teeth. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Flint ran from the office back into the storm, desperate to reach his siblings before they could complete systematic elimination of the ranch hands. He found Duke reloading his pistol beside bodies of 3 men who'd tried to escape through the main exit. "Duke, stop. You have to stop. The nail Dad showed us, it wasn't the cornerstone nail. We made a mistake. These men are innocent." Duke looked at his brother with an expression mixing confusion with something approaching pity. "Flint, you're not thinking clearly. The stress is getting to you. These people attacked our family's honor. We're defending what matters." "They didn't attack anything. Carlos Mendez was fixing a loose board. The nail he bent was just random hardware, not anything that belonged to grandfather." "That's impossible. Dad wouldn't make a mistake about something that important." "Dad's lost his mind. He's sitting in that office coughing up blood and talking about defending legacies that died with the mill. He can't tell the difference between reality and what he needs to believe." Duke's face hardened. "Don't talk about him that way. Look around you. Look at what we've done. 16 men are dead because Dad couldn't accept that a piece of metal got bent by accident." "Shut up. We're murderers, Duke, all of us. And for what? For nothing. For a delusion." Duke hit him with the pistol butt, a blow that sent Flint sprawling into snow. Before he could recover, Duke was on top of him, hitting him again and again with mechanical efficiency. "Dad was right about you," Duke said between blows. "You're weak. You don't understand what family loyalty means. You'd rather side with strangers than defend your own blood." The beating continued until Flint lost consciousness, his blood mixing with snow and ash around the mill's ruins. Duke dragged his unconscious brother back into the smoke-choked office where Oren still sat, contemplating the bent nail, then returned to his position to wait for remaining survivors. By 5:30, the last ranch hand was dead. Rowena had tracked the final survivor, Eddie Kowalski, to a creek bed half a mile from the mill. She found him trying to build shelter from pine branches and snow, already hypothermic and barely conscious from exposure to temperatures that had dropped to -40 degrees. She shot him once through the head and left his body for the storm to bury. The Beckett mill collapsed completely at 6:15, the last steel framework finally succumbing to heat exceeding 1,000 degrees. The sound echoed across the valley like artillery fire, marking the end of 44 years of operation and the beginning of a legacy built entirely on blood and madness. Flint regained consciousness at dawn, alone in the ruins of his father's office with smoke still rising from collapsed timbers. His father was gone, presumably buried under tons of burning debris. His siblings were somewhere outside, completing their transformation from desperate family members into monsters that would haunt Montana nightmares for generations. He crawled from the wreckage and found the cornerstone, still intact despite everything. The original nail remained embedded in stone, straight and true and completely undamaged. Proof that 16 men had died for nothing more substantial than an old man's need to believe his suffering had meaning. The mill's final collapse came at 6:47 in the morning, just as gray dawn light began penetrating storm clouds. The last standing section was Oren's office, protected by steel girders that finally buckled when temperature exceeded 1,100 degrees. Oren Beckett died in the doorway, trapped under a beam, while flames consumed everything around him. He'd been crawling through smoke and debris with the bent nail still clutched in his fist, determined to prove one final time that his family's legacy mattered. His last words, heard by no one. Beckett legacy finally being defended. Then the roof came down, burying him under 40 years of dreams and illusions. Duke and Rowena found his body 20 minutes later. They knelt beside their father's corpse in snow, still warm from fire, and felt something like completion. The massacre was finished. The ranch hands were eliminated. Their family's honor had been defended in blood and flame. "We did what needed doing," Rowena said quietly. "He can rest now, knowing we stood up for the Beckett name." Duke nodded, already calculating their next moves. They'd killed 16 men systematically. When authorities arrived, there would be no explaining this away. They would face life in prison, possibly execution. "We need to disappear before anyone comes looking." They gathered supplies from the ruins, weapons, ammunition, food, warm clothing. Then they walked into forest that stretched for hundreds of miles, two people who'd crossed the darkest line possible and now faced the choice between capture and life as fugitives. Flint remained unconscious until 8:30, when approaching vehicles penetrated his concussion-induced stupor. He crawled from the collapsed office, frostbitten and delirious, his face a mask of frozen blood. He was alive, the only family member who hadn't fled into the forest. He stumbled through the ruins, seeing bodies scattered in snow, seeing blood and ash and remnants of what had once been Dawson County's pride. And he began repeating the same phrase over and over. It was already broken. It was already broken. Montana State Trooper Gary Fletcher arrived first, responding to reports of a massive fire visible from 10 miles away. He'd expected an industrial accident. What he found was a war zone, bodies scattered across a quarter-mile radius, evidence of systematic execution. "Dispatch, this is Fletcher. I need every available unit, and I need them now. We have multiple casualties, multiple gunshot victims. Just send everyone. And call the FBI." By noon, the mill site had become the largest crime scene in Montana history. Federal agents established a command post. The medical examiner began cataloging 16 bodies. Forensics teams marked shell casings and blood trails that told the story of a 4-hour hunt. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez walked the perimeter and felt awe at the systematic nature of the violence. This wasn't passion or rage. This was planned extermination carried out with military precision. The investigation began with Flint's rambling confession, delivered through tears and delirium while medics treated his hypothermia and head trauma. "The nail was already broken," he kept repeating. "Dad thought they bent it on purpose, but it was already broken. Dad needed it to mean something, needed someone to blame." Agent Martinez struggled to believe mass murder could have such trivial origin. "You're saying your family killed 16 men over a bent nail?" "Over what the nail represented to my father, his identity, his legacy. When he saw it bent, he couldn't accept that it was accident. Had to be attack, had to be conspiracy." The community's reaction split predictably. Some expressed horror, demanding Duke and Rowena be found and executed. Others quietly admitted they understood the desperation that had driven the family to extremes. National media arrived within 48 hours, transforming Dawson County into a symbol of rural America's economic collapse and the violence that desperation could breed. CNN, NBC, ABC all sent correspondents to cover the massacre, trying to explain how property damage had escalated into the worst mass killing in state history. Duke and Rowena vanished into the Montana wilderness like smoke. Despite massive search efforts involving hundreds of officers, tracking dogs, and helicopters with thermal imaging, no trace was found. They'd grown up in those mountains, knew every game trail and cave, understood how to survive in conditions that would kill most people within hours. Some believed they'd died of exposure during the first week. Others suspected they'd escaped to Canada or Mexico, were living under assumed names, where the Montana Sawmill Massacre was just another faded news story. Flint spent 6 weeks in psychiatric evaluation at Montana State Hospital, his mind fractured by the weight of what his family had done. When deemed competent to stand trial, his confession was so complete that prosecutors didn't need additional evidence. At his sentencing hearing, he addressed the families of the men his family had killed. "I participated in the murder of 16 innocent men because I believed my father when he said our family honor was worth defending with blood. I was wrong. There is no honor in murder. There is no legacy worth 16 lives. The nail was already broken. Everything my father believed about attack and conspiracy was delusion. Your husbands and fathers and sons died for nothing more than an old man's need to believe his suffering had meaning." The courtroom was silent except for weeping. Flint Beckett was led away to begin life in Montana State Prison, the only surviving member of a family that had transformed from victims of economic collapse into perpetrators of the worst massacre in state history. The Beckett mill site was bulldozed 6 months later, the twisted metal and burned timbers buried under tons of earth. But the real legacy wasn't supernatural. It was the uncomfortable knowledge that anyone could be pushed to the breaking point where grievance becomes justification for unthinkable acts. Flint Beckett's formal arrest came on December 18, 1980, when doctors at Billings General Hospital determined he was mentally competent to understand charges. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez read him his rights in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and burned flesh. "You're being charged with 16 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and unlawful imprisonment. Do you understand?" "I understand them," Flint replied quietly, "and I'm ready to confess to all of them." What followed was the most detailed confession in Montana criminal history, 18 hours documenting every aspect of the massacre. Flint spoke with precision, understanding that truth was his only form of redemption. "My father convinced us that bending that nail was an attack on our family legacy. He said these ranch hands were part of a conspiracy. We believed him because we needed to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that our suffering was meaningless." Agent Martinez had investigated dozens of homicides, but nothing had prepared her for the methodical nature of Flint's account. This wasn't passion. This was planned extermination by people who'd convinced themselves that murder was justice. While Flint confessed, the largest manhunt in Montana history was underway. More than 300 officers searched 2,000 square miles for Duke and Rowena Beckett. The operation involved tracking dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, and ground teams that knew the terrain. "These aren't career criminals," FBI Supervisory Agent James Crawford told reporters. "They're local people with intimate knowledge of terrain that could hide an army. They know where to find water, shelter, how to avoid areas we're most likely to search." The search continued through brutal winter weather. Searchers found evidence of camps, fire pits, and food caches, suggesting the fugitives were alive and moving through wilderness, but Duke and Rowena remained ghosts. Flint's trial began March 15, 1981, in Billings because finding an impartial jury in Dawson County was impossible. The prosecution, led by Montana Attorney General Patricia Hendricks, presented overwhelming evidence. Shell casings matched weapons found at the mill. Flint's confession was corroborated by physical evidence and witness testimony. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity. Flint Beckett was manipulated by a father whose grip on reality had deteriorated, defense attorney Michael Torres told the jury. The prosecution destroyed that argument. Flint Beckett was 34 years old, not a child. He made conscious choices to block exits, set fires, participate in systematic murder. Diminished capacity doesn't apply when someone spends hours planning deliberate elimination of 16 innocent people. The community's reaction split along predictable lines. Some expressed sympathy for Beckett family desperation. Others demanded maximum punishment. "I'm not defending what they did," rancher Earl Morrison told a reporter. Earl was Jake Morrison's uncle, had helped identify his nephew's body. "But I understand the hopelessness. When a family loses everything and nobody cares, something's going to break." The jury deliberated 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts. Judge Robert Blackwood imposed 16 consecutive life sentences without parole. The magnitude of these crimes defies comprehension. 16 families have been destroyed because one family couldn't accept that their hardship was market forces rather than personal attack. Duke and Rowena were captured April 22, 1981, when exhaustion forced them to shelter in a hunting cabin near the Canadian border. A game warden noticed smoke and called for backup when he recognized the fugitives. They surrendered without resistance, looking decades older than their ages, worn down by months of surviving like animals. Duke had lost 40 pounds and suffered frostbite. Rowena had developed pneumonia requiring weeks of hospitalization before trial. Their separate trials attracted national media attention, transforming the massacre into a symbol of rural America's economic collapse. Duke received 15 consecutive life sentences, his lawyers unable to overcome evidence that he'd personally killed at least 8 ranch hands. He expressed no remorse, telling the judge he'd defended family honor the way men were supposed to, before lawyers convinced everyone that rolling over was preferable to fighting back. Rowena received 12 consecutive life sentences after being found guilty of killing 5 ranch hands during her hunt through the storm. The impact on victim families created generational ripple effects. 16 wives became widows. 37 children lost fathers. Parents buried sons who died for no reason more substantial than an old man's need to believe his suffering had meaning. Sarah Bradley, Tom Bradley's widow, spoke for many families during Duke's sentencing. "These people stole everything from us, not just our husbands and fathers, but our faith that working hard and being decent would protect us from evil. They made us understand that anyone can become a monster if they decide their pain matters more than other people's lives." National coverage focused on economic anxiety and rural abandonment, but missed the deeper question that haunted investigators. How many other families were living on the edge of similar breakdowns? How many other desperate people were one bent nail away from deciding their grievances justified unthinkable violence? The uncomfortable answer was that conditions creating the Beckett family's rage existed throughout rural America. Economic collapse, social isolation, breakdown of traditional support systems, and growing sense that ordinary people had been abandoned by institutions supposed to protect them. The Montana Sawmill Massacre became a cautionary tale about consequences of that abandonment, a reminder that when people lose everything except their capacity for violence, results can destroy communities and haunt regions for generations. But it also became proof that even the most desperate circumstances don't justify crossing the line from victim to monster, and that choosing violence as a solution to injustice creates only more victims, more trauma, and more darkness in a world that already contains too much of both. Flint Beckett entered Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge on June 3, 1981, beginning a life sentence that would stretch across 4 decades. He was assigned to maximum security housing, where the state kept its most dangerous offenders and those whose crimes had attracted enough public attention to make them targets. The first 5 years were the hardest. Flint struggled with nightmares that replayed the massacre in vivid detail, waking screams that echoed through the cell block. Prison psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morrison diagnosed him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder complicated by perpetrator trauma, the psychological damage that comes from being the cause rather than victim of violence. Flint experiences guilt and horror at levels that would be debilitating for most people, Dr. Morrison wrote in her evaluation. He's fully aware of the magnitude of what he did, fully accepts responsibility, and fully understands that no amount of remorse can undo the harm. Flint survived by finding purpose in the prison library, spending 12 hours a day helping illiterate inmates learn to read and writing letters to families of the men his family had killed. Not seeking forgiveness, but providing whatever closure his detailed memories might offer. Sarah Bradley, Tom Bradley's widow, was one of the few who responded. Their 17-year correspondence became a form of mutual healing. "I don't forgive you," she wrote in 1987. "I can't forgive you, and I never will. But I appreciate your honesty about what happened." Duke Beckett's prison experience followed a different trajectory. Incarcerated at Leavenworth, he was embraced by white supremacist groups who viewed his crimes as justified resistance. Instead of experiencing guilt, Duke developed an ideology that transformed the massacre from criminal act into political statement. The Beckett family stood up for themselves when the government failed to protect their livelihood, he wrote in an underground newsletter. What happened in Montana was war, not murder. His cell became a command center for correspondence with militia groups throughout the Mountain West. Rowena spent her first decade undergoing intensive psychiatric evaluation, showing signs of genuine psychological breakdown. Dr. Patricia Engels diagnosed her with severe bipolar disorder, complicated by delayed understanding of her crime's magnitude. Her condition deteriorated in 1991 when she learned that her father's bent nail was displayed in the Montana Historical Society's exhibit about rural violence. Dawson County struggled to rebuild both its economy and identity after becoming known for the worst massacre in Montana history. Federal aid programs and private investment created new opportunities in tourism, small manufacturing, and service industries. By 1990, unemployment had dropped from 37% to 8%, though new jobs paid less than mill work. Community healing proved more difficult than economic recovery. The massacre had exposed divisions between families who'd supported the Becketts and those who'd condemned them. Some residents moved away, unable to live where neighbors had committed such violence. Others worked to ensure victims were remembered with dignity. Memorial efforts began in 1983 when families established the Ranch Hand Memorial Fund. The memorial, completed in 1985, consisted of 16 granite stones arranged in a circle on a hill overlooking the valley. Each stone bore one victim's name and an inscription celebrating his life. The Beckett Mill site became controversial. Some wanted it preserved as education about violence consequences. Others demanded complete obliteration. The compromise involved demolishing all structures, but preserving the original cornerstone with its straight, undamaged nail as part of a memorial garden. The cornerstone memorial bore a simple inscription. Here stood the Beckett Mill, 1936 to 1980. On December 15, 1980, 16 ranch hands seeking shelter were murdered by the mill's owners. This tragedy reminds us that desperation is not justification for violence. Ranch hands who'd survived carried psychological scars that never healed. Frank Martinez, who'd escaped the burning mill, struggled with survivor's guilt. "I dream about them every night," he told researchers. Tom Bradley, Jake Morrison, Carlos Mendez. "They ask why I lived when they died. I was just lucky. But luck feels like betrayal." Psychological analysis identified patterns that would appear in later rural violence incidents. Economic desperation combined with social isolation created conditions where grievance could become justification for extreme violence. The breakdown of support systems left families vulnerable to psychological deterioration. Dr. William Reynolds of Montana State University studied the massacre for 15 years, concluding that the Beckett transformation represented a broader pattern in communities abandoned by economic change. When people lose their livelihood, social status, and sense of purpose simultaneously, they become vulnerable to radical reinterpretations. The Becketts convinced themselves they were under attack rather than simply unfortunate, that neighbors were enemies rather than fellow victims, that violence was justice rather than murder. These cognitive distortions are predictable responses to overwhelming loss, occurring throughout rural America wherever economic change has left communities behind. The uncomfortable truth was that conditions creating the Beckett family's rage existed throughout rural America. Economic collapse, social isolation, breakdown of traditional support systems, and growing sense that ordinary people had been abandoned by institutions supposed to protect them. December 15, 2023. 43 years after the Montana Sawmill Massacre, Flint. Beckett walked out of Montana State Prison at 7:30 in the morning, a 77-year-old man who'd spent more than half his life behind bars. He carried everything he owned in a cardboard box, letters from victim families, books about redemption, and a photograph of the bent nail that had triggered the worst mass killing in Montana history. Flint chose to return to Dawson County, renting a one-room apartment above the hardware store. The dying lumber community of 1980 had transformed into a modest but stable economy based on outdoor recreation and remote work. The population had stabilized at 18,000, but the people were different, younger, more educated, less connected to extractive industries that had defined the region. The memorial to the 16 ranch hands had become a pilgrimage site for people studying rural violence. Tour groups arrived monthly to hear about the massacre, though many struggled to understand how property damage could escalate to systematic murder. The memorial garden included the original mill cornerstone with its straight, undamaged nail, a reminder that the tragedy had been built on delusion rather than genuine grievance. Sarah Bradley, now 79 and the last surviving widow of the ranch hands, served as the memorial's volunteer coordinator. She'd maintained correspondence with Flint throughout his incarceration, not from forgiveness, but from need to ensure the tragedy's complexity wasn't lost in simplified narratives. "People want this story to make sense," she told a documentary filmmaker in 2022. "They want clear villains and obvious victims, but the truth is messier. The Becketts were monsters, but they were also desperate people who'd lost everything except their capacity for violence. Understanding that doesn't excuse what they did, but it might prevent someone else from following the same path." The lessons of the massacre seemed largely unlearned in broader American society. Rural communities throughout the Mountain West continued experiencing the same economic pressures that had destabilized Dawson County in 1980. Mining towns faced environmental regulations that eliminated jobs without providing alternatives. Agricultural communities struggled with corporate consolidation. Timber regions confronted federal policies that restricted harvesting without addressing social costs. And in some communities, families were experiencing the same combination of economic desperation, social isolation, and psychological deterioration that had transformed the Becketts from hardworking citizens into mass murderers. The warning signs were there: increasing paranoia about conspiracies, growing isolation from community institutions, tendency to interpret random events as evidence of coordinated attacks. Duke Beckett died in federal prison in 2018, 69 years old, and still convinced his family had been justified. He'd spent 37 years writing manifestos and recruiting followers for a rural uprising that never materialized, transforming from desperate son into ideological extremist who viewed the massacre as the opening shot in a war between traditional America and forces trying to destroy it. Rowena remained incarcerated at the women's facility in Billings, her mental health continuing to deteriorate despite decades of treatment. Now 71, she spent most of her time in a psychiatric unit, alternating between periods of clarity where she expressed horror at her actions and episodes where she retreated into fantasies about defending family honor. The Beckett name had been effectively erased from Dawson County. No roads, buildings, or monuments bore the family designation. The few relatives who'd survived had changed their names and moved to distant states, wanting no connection to the legacy of blood and madness. The bent nail itself resided in a climate-controlled display case at the Montana Historical Society in Helena. Museum visitors could see it alongside exhibits about rural violence, economic displacement, and psychological factors that transform grievance into justification for extreme action. The nail looked unremarkable, just hardware damaged by time and weather, nothing that could reasonably justify eliminating 16 human beings. But that ordinariness was precisely the point. The museum's exhibit explained that mass violence rarely begins with dramatic provocations. Instead, it grows from accumulation of smaller disappointments, gradual erosion of hope, and desperate need to find meaning in suffering that might otherwise seem random and purposeless. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who'd spent 20 years studying the massacre, identified patterns that continued appearing in communities throughout America. Economic displacement created vulnerability to radical ideologies. Social isolation prevented early intervention, and absence of mental health resources meant psychological deterioration went untreated until it manifested as violence. The Beckett Massacre wasn't an anomaly, Dr. Walsh wrote in her book, When Neighbors Become Enemies. It was an extreme example of dynamics existing throughout rural America wherever economic change has left communities behind. We're still creating conditions that produce this kind of violence, and we're still failing to recognize warning signs until it's too late. Flint spent his final years writing to researchers, policymakers, and community leaders, trying to prevent other families from following his family's path from desperation to destruction. His message was simple but urgent. Economic abandonment creates psychological vulnerability that can transform ordinary grievance into murderous delusion. The nail was already broken, he wrote in a 2023 letter to a congressional committee studying rural violence. My father's suffering was real, our hardship was genuine, but the conspiracy he constructed was entirely in his head. 16 men died because we couldn't accept that sometimes bad things happen for no reason except bad luck and changing circumstances. Flint Beckett died of heart failure on March 12, 2024, alone in his apartment, surrounded by letters from victim families and research materials about preventing rural violence. His funeral drew 12 people: Sarah Bradley, 2 researchers who'd corresponded with him, and 9 strangers who'd read about his efforts to atone. But his warning remained urgent and largely unheeded. Throughout rural America, families continued experiencing the same pressures that had broken the Becketts: economic displacement, social isolation, absence of institutional support. And in some families, ordinary disappointment was metastasizing into dangerous resentment. Ordinary setbacks were being reinterpreted as evidence of conspiracy, and ordinary people were moving closer to the psychological breaking point where grievance becomes justification for unthinkable violence. Broken things stay broken, but they don't have to break other things in the process. The challenge for American society is learning to recognize warning signs before another bent nail triggers another massacre, before another family's pain becomes another community's nightmare, before another tragedy proves that we still haven't learned how to help our neighbors survive the loss of everything they thought their lives meant. 43 years later, Dawson County had healed and moved forward, but the conditions that created the Beckett Massacre remained embedded in rural America's fabric. The only question was whether we'd recognize them in time to prevent the next tragedy, or whether we'd continue ignoring warning signs until another ordinary family becomes extraordinary monsters, and another community learns what happens when broken people decide their pain justifies breaking everything around them.